It's very meaningful that you're here today, Clyde. Marjory's book, Everglades River of Grass, brought so many people into the Everglades through words, and your photography has brought so many people into the Everglades through images. It's very meaningful to have you here today. And I thought we could just start with how you got connected to the Everglades in the first place, because I heard you were taking color photos of beaches when you got to Florida.
Well, when I got to Florida, I had been taking pictures all around the country in color. And when I came here to see for sailing, I remember Flicka, Gentle Ben. Remember those programs on television? That's what I wanted to see, the Flicka. Flicka? Flipper.
Flipper.
My brain is flipping. So when I got here, didn't see a thing to photograph. When we drive across Alligator Alley, you see all these bird nests. I didn't realize bromeliads. I thought they were bird nests. Because when you see things from the road, it's a whole different perspective from your car. One day we were driving down to an art show. We were driving up to Orlando, and we're driving up at 27 on 27. We're Tom Gaskin's Fishing Creek, and there were signs there that said, "If your husband won't stop, take your shoes off and hit him in the head."
Mom did that.
So,
almost hit him in the head.
My wife stopped. Maybe, well, I decided, we'd been through these signs about 4 times. And finally I gave in, because my wife likes all the curios. Florida is losing all these really unique side businesses. So we stopped, and of course he had this plastic alligators, the cypress lamps, the cypress clocks, the typical, stuff for tourists. And Tom said, looking at me, and he says, "You're not very happy, are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm kind of boring." So he says, "I have a boardwalk in back." Now, I've seen in California. I'm from California. Seen the moving pictures of gators and snakes, all that stuff, and a boardwalk sounded really good. So I headed back there and discovered it was a boardwalk. A boardwalk. Nailed the trees, It definitely wasn't a handicap situation. And once I got into that forest of cypress trees and got to the end of the boardwalk with this beautiful swamp, I said, "Wow, this is Florida." I came back the next day and took a picture there. I was 4 years before I saw it. Now, I had seen the beaches I saw the beaches of Florida. I took pictures of beaches, but the first time they enter, and that was because you had to walk. Now, since then, things have changed. I walk all the time in the swamp now with water and up to my waist, carrying cameras, and it's glorious. And people in our gallery, we give swamp walks, and people come out refreshed. They said, "I can't believe that. That's the Everglades. The water's clear, clean. I thought it was supposed to be a swamp." And actually, it's a river. It's not really a swamp. A swamp usually is stagnant. For some reason, we've called this a swamp. I guess tradition or something, I'm not sure why. But Marjory was correct. And her analyzing of it. And the story of, I don't know if you know why she's titled it River of Grass. Because the Herald wanted them to write stories on the rivers of Florida. And they didn't consider the Everglades a river. And she says, "Yeah, it's a river." So that's why she titled it, because it was based upon the rivers of Florida.
I'll ask you a question, Clyde, about what being in that swamp water feels like, because you have a fascinating story, your family, about a deep personal connection to the Everglades, and you not only found a subject for your photography, you found healing personally. Would you tell us a little about that?
Well, in 1986, on Niki's and my anniversary and Father's Day, our son was killed in an automobile accident from a drunk driver. And of course, those things are pretty traumatic, not good. And we had an art show. I was doing color, and we had an art show up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I had all my color work, and I said, I was doing color work of the Everglades. But I said, I don't think the people are getting it. So when I got back, I took all my color work to the dump, got an 8x10 camera, and got out there and spent many, many, many hours and days. And that, I think, refreshed my soul. You can't believe by getting out there with nobody's out there, it's quiet, there's birds, when you get out in the Everglades where there's no people, you think maybe it's a dinosaur coming over the ridge. It's really primitive. And it's hard to find that in America today as primitive spots. There aren't rocks, of course, you got rocks, primitive rocks, but as far as landscape goes, there's one of a kind. And when I took, one of the first shots I took was this moonrise. And it was really interesting because the shutter wouldn't work on the camera. This is this beautiful, I'm going to make it's going to be a great picture. The shutter wouldn't work. Now, I had bought an 8x10 camera with some old lenses, and it worked with this lens before. So I didn't give up. I took the lens apart out in the swamp and opened the shutter up with my fingers. And you know how I used to do it back in the 1800s, where they took a lens cap off and they go, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. Well, that's how that picture was taken, with the lens cap. But that period of time in the fall of '86, being out in the Everglades really changed my life. And that's when I went to black and white, because I thought black and white is the way. People aren't seeing, there's too much color in the Everglades. If you have all this color, you see, okay, the sky distracts away from the foreground, the water distracts from everything. So having black and white makes oneness with nature. And what's the most important in nature? Everything. There's not one more important than the other. It all works together. And in the Everglades, it's chaos. I say this to scientists. I says, the Everglades is chaos. And they say, no, it's not. It's biological order. And I say, yes, but visually it's chaos. So I have to make order out of chaos so you can see it. So that's my job, is to get you to feel like you're there. And when I started photographing the Everglades, I don't think anybody was really photographing them to speak of. And I was working with Water Management District. Now, Water Management District, a lot of people get down on water management. But when you talk to the scientists that work there, these guys are really knowledgeable and excited about the Everglades. So sometimes I learned more about the Everglades from water management than I did from Audubon, Sierra Club, all these different environmental organizations, because I want to know the real problems, the real things. And I started learning from them and working with them too to help understand what is all about, the Everglades is all about. And the only way you can see the Everglades, you got to walk in it. You can't see it from the road. You can't see it from the table here. But you have to come out. You have to come out and get in the water. When you do that, you'll have a whole new inspiration about helping the Everglades, because you don't want the whole Everglades to be covered with seawater, do we? I mean, it's very, very possible the Everglades will be gone if we don't get busy on doing our job as environmentalists.
Clyde, on that note, you have a quote from your book, your Everglades book, that really struck me. You said when you were out there in the Everglades in 1986, spending lengths of time for the first time, it dawned on you that, quote, we humans are part of a greater whole. You really had a spiritual epiphany out there.
Well, when you walk in the Everglades, you're connected, you feel spiritually connected, because I think we are 80% water, our body, and for some we're in the womb with water. I think we are based around water. And when you're walking in there and there's the bird, well, it's really interesting. When you go out there, don't move for a while and just listen. And people are amazed how all the sounds will start happening if you be really quiet. There's all kinds of critters out there crawling around, flying around, and but it's really gorgeous. And I've taken so many people out there that just lifts their souls.
Yeah, it was our family's healing waters, because we just got done with the Life Forks book, and it took me like 4 years to write. It's his biography, and I couldn't. In the 80s, after my brother died, him and my mom were like superheroes. They were full force using his art. I mean, he didn't have the money, he didn't have any of that, he didn't care, because when something happens to you, and you realize you need to be here for a purpose, that we're not going to go for, and they were lost. And by doing this biography, it was like family therapy, I realized that they took all their anger and their sadness of the death of my brother, and they focused it on the environment. I mean, the amount of things my parents did in 4 years, from 86 to like 91, was insane. What they did. You guys were doing this 24/7. If they couldn't save their son, they were going to save the Everglades. And that's what I got out of working on the biography with you. Because when something bad happens to you, and also the Everglades, when you guys got into it, they disappeared. You were in there, and he never came out. And I was like, oh my gosh, no one goes walking the Everglades. Dad's going to get eaten by a gator. But anyway, so the Everglades is a healing place. Mother Earth is a healing place. And we all need it.
Yeah, well, since I've been walking and photographing the Everglades, I'd really call it 1984 started. I have never met another person. How many national parks can you say that you've been in that you've never met another person over 40 years? Anybody got one of those parks that you've been in? I mean, I was at the Rocky Mountain National Park, photographed this beautiful little stream. 1,000 people passed me. You go in the Tetons, people are crawling over those places. Everglades is this unique, prehistoric, it just hasn't changed that much in 10,000 years. And people don't realize the opportunity here to see the past history alive and growing. And it's part of our, for South Florida, it's really important because of water, for one thing.
So Clyde, on that note, how can we get more people out there? And actually, this is a two-part question, because I'm going to ask the question I think a lot of folks in the room have is, did you ever worry about the snakes and the alligators when you were immersed in it?
Yes. Jackie, did you ever worry about those?
My first 10 minutes into the walk, and then I kind of forgot.
Yeah. I met Oscar Thompson. He's a Floridian that lived in Fort Myers. He owned a camera shop. And I saw this work he's been doing of Big Cypress. And I had never been to Big Cypress, so I didn't really understand what it was. I saw these slides, and I said, I'd like to go out there sometime, Oscar. And he says, how about now? Okay. Now, I've seen all this. And he took me out on this old oil road with his 4-wheel drive. He didn't go in the water. It was obviously beautiful. And then I think the third time we went out, he takes off and goes down out in the water. I said, Oscar, there's gators and snakes out there. Yeah, they won't bother you. Of course, I learned later that he was a gator poacher. And he'd take care of them. Then eventually I figured he'd take care of them. But when I first went out there, first of all, he tells me the first probably 6 feet is the most dangerous part, because that's where frogs are, small animals are, and that's where the gators, go to feed. They look on the shore. And once you get past that 10 feet, you're probably okay. And then when I went out there, and I said, Oscar, why is this rock why is this all rock? He says, well, this used to be coral. Oh, then why is this so clear? Well, because it's running through grass, getting cleaned. I mean, it's cleaner probably than the Rocky Mountain stream right now, because the Rocky Mountains don't have 30 miles of grass to clean. It was just amazing to go out there and just say, well, I was stunned.
Clyde, I have to ask you about some famous guests you've brought on swamp walks. I think we have a photo of you and President Jimmy Carter out there. What was that like, and how does that change people when you bring folks into it with you?
Well, Jimmy Carter, he was an adventurous guy. He was a character. And he'd always wanted to see my work. He had been given a Canon digital camera. So at first I took him around the gallery, and I explained to him I'd use 8x10, sometimes it's 6-minute exposures. And he said, well, isn't this it difficult? I said, well, was it difficult running for president? Oh, yeah, anything worthwhile is difficult. And then when we went to the swamp walk, we had to give a talk. I gave a talk to everybody. And of course, the Secret Service guys, they were
They weren't happy.
they were not happy at all.
No.
We got to take these out with the snakes and gators, and they had guns and shotguns and pistols. And I said, here's a stick. This stick is it's better than any gun. You don't want to wound an animal. You want to just say, okay, go away.
Yeah, they wanted to know if there was a second exit just in case. Remember that?
Well, he was. So anyhow, we went out, and I was with Rosalind, because they had Secret Service guys with Carter, but I knew Rosalind might need some help. So I was staying close to her. And then, of course, she had her Secret Service lady. She was like 6 foot, big lady. And she says, I can't believe they're making me do this. Halfway through, she said to me, I'm getting paid to do this.
Yeah, I tell people when they say they're scared to go in the swamp, when I first talked to the Secret Service lady, she goes, I don't want to do this. I said, you could take a bullet for the president and you're scared to go on a swamp walk?
Let me ask you about a much shorter woman, Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Marjory, I don't think she stood 5 feet tall. What impact did she have on your life, Clyde?
Well, when I got interested in the Everglades, I got her book, got to read her book, and I was learning about it. It's before water management. And of course, I was kind of, trying to be the messenger of the visual parts of the Everglades. And then in her 100th birthday, they asked me to do her birthday card. And that was the moonrise that we first saw here. It was for her 100th anniversary. And then for her 101st anniversary we did a poster, and we had a big gallery, and we had violin people there, and it was really kind of neat, a little orchestra. And she would sign posters, and she would answer a few questions here and there. And then when Bob Graham came in, it was like a switch went on. Verbs came out of her mouth. She knew everything that was going on. I mean, at 101, she said, "Now you can what now what?" And, he asked pertinent questions to Graham, and he was going, "Oh, okay." You can't. It was really interesting. So she was an amazing woman. She started her environmental movement when she was 70.
Yep, she founded Friends of the Everglades when she was 79, 1969.
Yeah.
We have a lot of time left.
69.
It was 1969, but she was 79 years old.
Yeah, and how many start environmental thing when you're that old? I mean, I said, I'm too old to do that. People tell me, when I ask them, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm too old to do that. You're never too old.
Well, I think we could sit up here all day and chat, and I wish we could. But I do want to end with one question related to a line in your Everglades book again about the development that has cannibalized so much of the Everglades. You wrote, "Suddenly my photographs were becoming history rather than images of how Florida presently appeared." Tell us about the changes that have concerned you in the Everglades and what you think we can all do about it.
Well, I see a lot of places where, there was beautiful places and there's buildings. And, on the other hand, I see a lot of problems, but also I see a lot of positive stuff happening because of organizations. Like how many of these bridges that crossed 41 are getting more water into the Everglades. I mean, there's a lot of bad things happening and a lot of good things happening. And in photography, it's kind of interesting. Take photography. A negative makes a positive. Interesting? And that's what we're doing here. We're taking these negatives and we're making positives out of them. And you have to think about it. Yeah, it's a negative, but we can change it into a positive. I think that's. I thought that was it's been my thought and my background that we can do it. It's not going to be easy, and I tell you what, progress is hard to stop. When I'm an architect by trade, and back in the 60s, our idea was to build a high-rise and have a bunch of ground around it. And we did that. Then later on, they filled in the ground with houses. So we have these grand thoughts, but there's always going to be everything on this earth is biological, and everything is aggressive. And it's a challenge between the aggression and, like an oak tree, hardly anything wants to live under an oak tree because the oak tree kills it with the acids. So you have to realize that this is a biological world and everything's trying to survive. And then people are trying to have houses. They could have smaller houses. They could have solar panels on their houses. They could have electric cars. They could have things that are not creating problems, but those are decisions. And I think that there's one thing that we have to keep in mind. I have so many people saying, we got to teach the children so it'll do better. Well, if we don't teach the adults, there won't be anything to survive.
That is a great point to wrap up on. Some applause for Clyde and Jackie.